In the deep hours when the modern world grows quiet and the mind drifts toward older truths, we embark on a journey through 35 centuries of humanity's most enduring stories. Tonight, let yourself slip into the timeless realm of ancient mythology, where gods transformed into animals to deceive mortals, where heroes descended into underworlds that mirrored their own psychological depths, and where the very foundations of reality were forged through cosmic battles between order and chaos. There's no need to rush through these eternal narratives, no need to grasp every detail or remember every divine name. Simply allow the stories to unfold like the slow turning of seasons and forget about time completely. These myths emerged from every corner of the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the marble temples of Greece, from the misty forests of the Celtic lands to the sacred mountains of the East, each culture contributing its own voice to humanity's collective attempt to understand love, death, power, and the mysterious forces that shape our destiny. Settle back, breathe deeply, and prepare to witness the birth of storytelling itself. The ancient voices await in the shadows between sleeping and waking, Inanna descending into death's realm, Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, Medea orchestrating her terrible revenge, and countless others whose stories have shaped the very foundations of human imagination for millennia. Before written history carved its first symbols into clay and stone, the human imagination was already spinning tales of such psychological complexity and narrative sophistication that they would survive every conquest, every cultural transformation, every attempt to replace them with newer stories. These were not simple entertainment for primitive minds, but profound explorations of the human condition that addressed fundamental questions about power, love, mortality, and meaning with a depth that continues to astound contemporary audiences. The oldest of these stories emerged from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE, where Sumerian poets first recorded the epic of Inanna, the goddess whose journey into the underworld established templates for understanding death, transformation, and rebirth that would influence religious and psychological thought for 3 millennia. But Inanna's story was far from the gentle allegory that later generations would make it. It was a dark exploration of power, betrayal, and the terrible price of transcendence. Inanna's descent began not with noble purpose, but with curiosity and ambition. The queen of heaven and earth, already ruler of love and war, fertility and destruction, heard the sounds of mourning from her sister's realm below and decided she must witness this domain she had never seen. Her decision to descend was not heroic self-sacrifice, but the compulsion of absolute power that could not tolerate any boundary, any mystery, any realm beyond its reach. The underworld she entered was ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, goddess of death and keeper of the realm where all mortals eventually journeyed. But this was not the peaceful afterlife of later mythologies. It was a place of dust and silence, where the dead existed as pale shadows dependent on offerings from the living for sustenance. Ereshkigal's domain was one of absolute authority, where even gods faced annihilation if they violated its ancient laws. The confrontation between the sisters was not a meeting of equals, but a collision between opposing cosmic principles. Inanna arrived in the underworld wearing her full divine regalia, the crown of heaven, the rod of justice, the rainbow necklace, and all the symbols of her absolute authority in the upper world. But the underworld had its own laws, and no one, not even the Queen of Heaven, could enter Death's realm without surrendering everything that marked them as belonging to life. At each of the 7 gates that led deeper into the underworld, Inanna was forced to remove one piece of her divine authority. First her crown, then her staff, then each ornament and garment that signified her power, until she stood naked and powerless before her sister's throne. This stripping away was not merely ceremonial but ontological. With each item removed, Inanna lost not just symbols but actual divine capabilities that had defined her existence. The judgment that Ereshkigal pronounced was swift and absolute. Inanna was struck dead with a look and hung on a hook like meat, her corpse left to rot in the darkness while her divine essence was absorbed into the underworld's fabric. But her death was not a simple ending. It was a cosmic catastrophe that sent ripples throughout creation. With Inanna dead, fertility ceased on Earth, sexual activity stopped, and the natural cycles of renewal ground to a halt. The rescue operation that followed required the intervention of Enki, god of wisdom and water, who created two genderless creatures from dirt under his fingernails and sent them into the underworld to retrieve Inanna's body. But even divine wisdom could not simply undo death's work. The creature succeeded in reviving Inanna only by tricking Ereshkigal during a moment of vulnerability, showing sympathy for the lonely queen's suffering and earning her temporary gratitude. The price of Inanna's restoration was that someone else had to take her place in the underworld for half of each year. Various candidates were considered, but ultimately her lover Dumuzi was chosen when he failed to mourn her death appropriately. His condemnation came not from divine caprice, but from Inanna's rage at finding him celebrating on his throne, instead of grieving her loss. The goddess who had experienced death firsthand could not forgive anyone who took life for granted. This ancient story established patterns that would echo through mythology for millennia: the hero's journey into death's realm, the sacrifice required for wisdom, the seasonal cycle of death and renewal, and the terrible price of transcendence. But it also contained psychological insights about power, relationship, and the shadow side of divinity that more sanitized versions would lose. Inanna was not a perfect goddess, but a complex figure whose greatness and flaws were inextricably intertwined. The Epic of Gilgamesh, emerging from the same cultural matrix several centuries later, took these themes in different directions while maintaining the same psychological sophistication. But Gilgamesh's story began not with divine ambition, but with very human tyranny. The hero who would become mythology's first great seeker of immortality started as an oppressive king, whose abuse of power created the conditions that would ultimately transform him. Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk with absolute authority, using his semi-divine status to claim any privilege he desired, including the right to sleep with brides before their husbands and to conscript citizens for his building projects without regard for their welfare or consent. His subjects' complaints reached the gods, who decided that the only way to moderate Gilgamesh's behaviour was to create an equal who could challenge him. The creation of Enkidu represented one of mythology's most sophisticated treatments of the nature versus civilization theme. This wild man was literally shaped from clay and divine breath, then placed in the wilderness where he lived among animals, protecting them from hunters and trappers. His transformation into a civilized being came through his encounter with Shamat, a temple woman whose wisdom and sexuality served as the bridge between wildness and culture. The 7-day union between Enkidu and Shamat was far more than sexual initiation. It was a complete ontological transformation that cut Enkidu off from his animal companions while opening his consciousness to human possibilities. When the animals rejected him after his change, Enkidu faced the fundamental isolation that comes with consciousness and choice. He could no longer live in innocent harmony with nature, but had gained the capacity for friendship, creativity, and self-determination that would define his relationship with Gilgamesh. The battle between Gilgamesh and Enkidu when they first met was a collision between different forms of power, the civilized authority of kingship against the natural strength of wildness. Their fight shook the very foundations of Uruk, but rather than ending in victory for either combatant, it resolved in mutual recognition and the beginning of a friendship so intense that it would define both characters more than any individual achievement. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embarked on adventures that established many of the heroic patterns that would persist throughout world mythology. Their journey to the cedar forest to battle the monster Humbaba was not simply a quest for glory, but a confrontation with the supernatural guardians that protected the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. Humbaba's defeat represented humanity's growing power to reshape the natural environment, but it also suggested the dangerous consequences of such presumption. The killing of the Bull of Heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar to punish Gilgamesh for spurning her romantic advances, demonstrated how heroic achievement could provoke divine retribution. The hero's success in defeating this cosmic bull was a triumph of mortal cooperation over divine caprice, but it also violated the natural order in ways that demanded compensation. The price of their heroic transgressions was Enkidu's death, decreed by divine council as appropriate punishment for mortal presumption. But Enkidu's dying was not a simple event. It was a prolonged process during which he cursed those who had brought him to civilization before finally accepting his fate and blessing the experiences that had given his life meaning. His death scenes remain among the most powerful explorations of mortality in all ancient literature. Gilgamesh's grief at losing Enkidu transformed him from a hero seeking glory into a philosopher confronting ultimate questions about meaning and mortality. His refusal to accept the finality of death drove him to seek out Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood who had been granted immortality by the gods. This quest took Gilgamesh beyond the boundaries of the known world into regions where no mortal had ever travelled. The flood story that Utnapishtim recounted provided one of literature's first great treatments of cosmic destruction and renewal. Unlike later flood narratives that emphasized divine justice or human wickedness, this version presented the deluge as resulting from divine annoyance with human noise and overpopulation. The gods' decision to destroy humanity was not moral judgment, but cosmic housekeeping that went too far, requiring divine intervention to prevent complete annihilation. Utnapishtim's survival had come through divine warning and careful preparation, but his immortality was granted almost accidentally, as compensation for the trauma he had endured rather than reward for exceptional virtue. This detail suggested that divine favour was often arbitrary rather than earned, a theme that would persist through ancient mythology. The test that Utnapishtim offered Gilgamesh, to remain awake for 6 days and 7 nights, was designed to demonstrate that even the greatest heroes could not transcend basic human limitations. Gilgamesh's immediate failure, falling asleep before the test had barely begun, proved that immortality required more than heroic achievement or iron will. The plant of youth that Gilgamesh retrieved from the ocean floor represented a consolation prize, offering renewal rather than eternal life. But even this limited gift was lost when a serpent stole the plant while Gilgamesh bathed, leaving him empty-handed but perhaps wiser. The serpent's theft was both cosmic justice and natural law, the eternal principle that life energy moves in cycles rather than accumulating in individuals. Gilgamesh's return to Uruk at the epic's end found him contemplating the walls of his city and discovering a form of immortality in human achievement that outlasts individual mortality. The epic's final message suggested that meaning came not from escaping the human condition, but from embracing it fully while creating works that would survive personal death. These Mesopotamian myths established fundamental patterns that would influence storytelling for millennia, but they also contained psychological insights about friendship, power, mortality, and transcendence that remain relevant to contemporary audiences. Their treatment of divine human relationships, the costs of heroic achievement, and the necessity of accepting limitation while still striving for greatness created templates that would be endlessly adapted and reinterpreted by later cultures. The mythologies that emerged in Egypt during the same period took different approaches to similar themes, while developing their own unique perspectives on divine nature, cosmic order, and human destiny. The story of Osiris, Isis, and Set became perhaps the ancient world's most influential exploration of death, resurrection, and the triumph of order over chaos. Osiris began as the perfect king of the Golden Age, a ruler who taught humanity agriculture, law, and the arts of civilization while governing with justice and wisdom. His perfection was not static virtue but active benevolence that created the conditions for human flourishing. Under his reign, the world knew neither war nor want, neither injustice nor suffering. But Osiris's very perfection created the conditions for his destruction. His younger brother Set, god of chaos in the desert, could not tolerate the comparison that made his own more tumultuous nature seem deficient. Set's psychology was complex. He was not evil in the simple sense, but rather the divine embodiment of the principle that all order eventually becomes rigid and requires violent disruption to remain vital. The murder of Osiris was accomplished through deception rather than direct assault. Set created a beautiful coffin, precisely fitted to Osiris's measurements, then during a feast tricked his brother into lying down in it to demonstrate its perfect fit. The moment Osiris lay down, Set sealed the coffin and cast it into the Nile, creating a death that was both intimate betrayal and cosmic catastrophe. The dismemberment of Osiris that followed represented an even deeper level of destruction. Set cut his brother's body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt, ensuring that no single place could claim complete possession of the god and that any restoration would require cooperation across the entire land. This scattering was simultaneously complete destruction and the creation of conditions that would make new unity possible. Isis's response to her husband's murder established her as perhaps the most psychologically complex goddess in ancient mythology. Her search for Osiris's scattered remains was not simply wifely devotion, but a cosmic quest that required her to develop new forms of magic, new understanding of death and resurrection, and new ways of relating to both divine and mortal realms. The magic that Isis developed during her search was unlike the power wielded by other Egyptian deities. Where most gods simply commanded obedience from forces they governed, Isis learned to work with fundamental principles underlying all existence, discovering how to heal what seemed beyond healing and how to create new life from death itself. Her successful resurrection of Osiris, long enough for him to father Horus, established precedents that would influence religious thought for thousands of years. Death was not final, love could transcend physical destruction, and determination could literally reshape cosmic reality. But the resurrection was temporary. Osiris could not remain in the world of the living, but had to become ruler of the underworld, leaving Isis to raise their child as a single mother. The childhood of Horus, raised by Isis while hiding from Set's attempts to kill him, became one of mythology's richest treatments of how heroes develop under conditions of constant threat. The young god's growth occurred in secret, requiring his mother to become protector, teacher, and strategic planner for an eventual confrontation with overwhelming power. The conflict between Horus and Set for control of Egypt became the mythological template for understanding political legitimacy, the nature of justice, and the relationship between order and chaos. This was not simple good versus evil, but a complex struggle between different principles of authority and different approaches to divine kingship. Set's claim to the throne was not without merit. As Osiris's brother and a god of enormous power, he had dynastic rights, and his chaotic nature performed essential cosmic functions. His supporters could argue that he represented necessary change and prevented the universe from becoming too rigid. The trial that resolved their conflict involved multiple contests, divine testimony, and even sexual politics as both claimants sought to establish dominance. The resolution, with Horus awarded the throne while Set retained rule over desert and foreign lands, established cosmic balance rather than simple victory. Both gods maintained essential functions, Horus as principle of ordered justice, Set as force of creative disruption. This balance became the foundation for Egyptian kingship, with each pharaoh understood as Horus incarnate. As these Near Eastern mythologies were developing their sophisticated treatments of divine psychology and cosmic order, other cultures were creating their own distinctive approaches to understanding the relationship between gods and mortals, the nature of heroism, and the meaning of existence itself. The Greek mythological tradition that began emerging around 1500 BCE would eventually become the most influential storytelling system in Western culture, but its early forms were far darker and more psychologically complex than the sanitized versions that later generations inherited. The stories that Homer preserved in the Iliad and Odyssey represented the culmination of centuries of oral tradition that had explored every aspect of human nature through divine narratives of remarkable sophistication. The Trojan War that provided the background for Homer's epics was not a simple conflict between opposing armies, but a cosmic drama that explored themes of honor, loyalty, love, and the relationship between individual desire and collective responsibility. The war's origin in Paris's judgment of the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, established it as a conflict driven by divine vanity and mortal consequence, rather than simple political or economic interests. Paris's choice of Aphrodite over her rivals, motivated by her promise of the most beautiful woman in the world, set in motion events that would destroy entire civilizations, while providing the raw material for some of literature's greatest explorations of heroic psychology and tragic necessity. His abduction of Helen was simultaneously personal choice and cosmic inevitability, individual act and mythological archetype. The heroes who fought at Troy were not simple warriors, but complex figures whose personal stories illuminated different aspects of heroic possibility and limitation. Achilles embodied the hero whose greatness and destruction were inseparably linked. His divine armor made him nearly invincible, but his human psychology made him vulnerable to the rage that would ultimately define his legacy. Achilles' wrath, which drives the entire Iliad, began with a seemingly minor dispute over captive women, but escalated into a cosmic principle that threatened to destroy not just individuals but the entire heroic world. His withdrawal from battle, after being dishonored by Agamemnon, was not mere petulance, but a fundamental challenge to the values that held Greek society together. The death of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, transformed personal grief into cosmic fury that swept everything before it. Achilles' return to battle was not heroic triumph, but tragic necessity. He knew that killing Hector would seal his own doom, but his love for Patroclus made that choice inevitable. The psychology of grief driving heroic action created some of literature's most powerful explorations of how personal loss can become universal meaning. Hector's role as Troy's defender presented heroism from a different perspective, the hero fighting not for personal glory but for family, city, and civilization itself. His farewell to his wife, Andromache, and infant son provided an intimate counterpoint to the epic's cosmic themes, showing how individual relationships give meaning to larger conflicts. The ransoming of Hector's body by his father Priam created the Iliad's most psychologically complex scene, as the grieving king faced his son's killer and found common humanity in shared sorrow. Achilles' acceptance of Priam's plea represented not forgiveness, but recognition of the universal nature of loss and the dignity that suffering could create in both victor and vanquished. Odysseus' 10-year journey home from Troy provided a different template for heroic achievement, emphasizing intelligence, adaptability, and endurance over martial prowess. His encounters with supernatural beings, the Cyclops, the Sirens, Circe, the dead in Hades, created a geography of consciousness that mapped the psychological challenges facing anyone seeking to return to normal life after traumatic experience. The Cyclops episode demonstrated how heroic intelligence could triumph over brute force, while also showing how pride could transform victory into disaster. Odysseus' clever escape from Polyphemus' cave was brilliant strategy, but his need to reveal his identity turned triumph into curse as Poseidon's wrath pursued him across the wine-dark sea. The Siren's song represented temptation that could only be resisted through preparation and self-knowledge. Odysseus' strategy of having himself bound while his crew stopped their ears showed how awareness of one's weaknesses could become a form of strength, how limitation accepted could become transcendence achieved. Circe's transformation of Odysseus' men into swine provided a savage commentary on how easily civilization could be stripped away, how quickly heroes could become beasts when faced with supernatural power and their own unchecked appetites. Only Odysseus, protected by divine aid and warned by previous experience, could resist her magic and negotiate the restoration of his companions. The journey to Hades allowed Odysseus to encounter the dead and learn what survived death's transformation. His meeting with Achilles provided a bitter commentary on heroic values. The greatest warrior of the heroic age declared he would rather be a living slave than a dead king, suggesting that life itself was more precious than any glory that outlasted it. The return to Ithaca and the slaughter of the suitors completed Odysseus' transformation from wandering hero to established king, but the violence required to reclaim his throne raised questions about the relationship between justice and revenge, order and brutality. The epic's ending suggested that heroic homecoming required not just personal achievement, but social restoration that balanced individual rights with collective welfare. These Homeric epics established heroic templates that would influence Western literature for millennia, but they also contained psychological insights about trauma, identity, and the costs of achievement that remain relevant to contemporary understanding of human development and social relationships. The Greek tragic tradition that developed from these mythological foundations created some of the most psychologically penetrating treatments of human nature ever produced, exploring how individual character interacted with cosmic forces and social pressures to create destinies that were simultaneously chosen and inevitable. Aeschylus's Oresteia presented the myth of the House of Atreus as a meditation on justice, revenge, and the evolution of human civilization from primitive blood feud to reasoned judgment. The curse that plagued Atreus' descendants across multiple generations demonstrated how violence begets violence in endless cycles that can only be broken through fundamental changes in how human communities understand justice and divine will. Agamemnon's murder by his wife Clytemnestra was presented not as simple crime but as cosmic necessity. The king who sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to ensure favourable winds for the Trojan expedition had violated fundamental natural law and faced inevitable retribution. Clytemnestra's revenge was simultaneously personal choice and divine justice, individual act and mythological archetype. The revenge taken by Orestes against his mother created an impossible moral dilemma. Duty to his father demanded matricide, but killing his mother violated the most fundamental taboos of Greek society. His madness after the murder, pursued by the Furies who embodied the ancient law of blood vengeance, represented the psychological cost of moral impossibility. The trial of Orestes that concluded the trilogy established the principle that human justice could evolve beyond primitive vengeance through reasoned judgment and divine guidance. The Furies' transformation into beneficent protectors suggested that even the most destructive forces could serve constructive purposes when properly understood and channeled. Sophocles' treatment of the Oedipus myth created perhaps the most psychologically complex exploration of fate, knowledge, and self-destruction in all ancient literature. Oedipus's attempt to escape the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother created the very conditions that made its fulfillment inevitable, demonstrating how consciousness and choice could become the instruments of cosmic necessity. The irony that permeated Oedipus's story was not simple dramatic device but philosophical exploration of how knowledge and ignorance, wisdom and blindness, salvation and destruction could be inextricably intertwined. Every action Oedipus took to avoid his fate brought him closer to its realization. Every display of intelligence revealed deeper forms of ignorance about his own nature and circumstances. The revelation of Oedipus's true identity destroyed not only his personal happiness, but his understanding of reality itself. The man who had solved the Sphinx's riddle and saved Thebes discovered that he had been the source of the very pollution he sought to eliminate, that his greatest triumph contained the seeds of his ultimate destruction. Jocasta's response to the unfolding truth demonstrated how different forms of consciousness could coexist within the same events. While Oedipus pursued knowledge regardless of consequences, she recognized the approaching disaster and chose death rather than face the complete dissolution of meaning that truth would bring. The self-blinding that followed Oedipus's discovery was not simple punishment, but complex symbolic action that represented both justice and transcendence, destruction and illumination. In losing his physical sight, Oedipus gained spiritual vision that would enable him to serve as prophet and guide despite his personal ruin. Euripides' treatment of mythological themes emphasized the psychological realism and moral ambiguity that made ancient stories relevant to contemporary audiences. His Medea presented perhaps the most psychologically penetrating treatment of revenge, betrayal, and the destructive power of abandoned love in all ancient literature. Medea's response to Jason's betrayal was not simple female fury, but cosmic rebellion against the injustice that reduced women to property and denied them agency in determining their own destinies. Her supernatural powers made her capable of revenge beyond ordinary human possibility, but her motivation came from recognizably human emotions pushed to their ultimate extremes. The murder of her own children represented the ultimate transgression against natural law, but Euripides presented it not as monstrous aberration, but as logical consequence of a society that offered women no alternatives to complete subordination. Medea's choice to kill her sons rather than leave them to face dishonor as children of an abandoned woman demonstrated how individual pathology could emerge from social injustice. The divine intervention that rescued Medea from human justice while leaving Jason to face the consequences of his betrayal suggested that cosmic order was more complex than human moral categories could encompass. The gods' protection of Medea was not approval of her actions but recognition that her revenge served larger purposes of cosmic balance. These Greek explorations of mythological themes created templates for understanding human psychology, social relationships, and moral responsibility that would influence Western thought for millennia. Their integration of individual psychology with cosmic themes demonstrated how personal stories could illuminate universal truths about the human condition. The Roman adaptations of Greek mythology that developed during the later centuries BCE added their own distinctive perspectives, while preserving the essential insights of the Greek tradition. Virgil's Aeneid created a new type of hero in Aeneas, whose greatness lay not in individual achievement, but in service to destiny and collective purpose. Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy was simultaneously personal odyssey and national epic, individual quest and cosmic necessity. His burden of carrying both the surviving Trojans and their household gods to a new homeland made him representative of how historical consciousness could create meaning from disaster, and how individual sacrifice could serve collective purposes. The underworld journey that occupied the Aeneid's central books provided Virgil with opportunities to explore Roman understanding of death, destiny, and historical purpose. Aeneas's encounter with his father Anchises in the Elysian fields created a vision of Roman destiny that justified contemporary imperial power through mythological precedent and divine approval. The love affair between Aeneas and Dido created the epic's most psychologically complex episode, exploring how individual happiness could conflict with cosmic purpose and how personal loyalty could compete with historical destiny. Aeneas's abandonment of Dido was not simple cruelty, but tragic necessity that demonstrated the costs of greatness and the sacrifice required for historical achievement. Dido's curse as Aeneas sailed away established the mythological foundation for the historical enmity between Rome and Carthage, while also creating one of literature's most powerful treatments of abandoned love and its consequences. Her transformation from gracious queen to destructive fury demonstrated how the same forces that created civilization could also destroy it. The establishment of Roman power in Italy required not only military conquest, but cultural integration that absorbed the best of existing traditions while imposing Roman order and values. The marriage between Aeneas and Lavinia symbolized this process of cultural synthesis, while also completing the hero's transformation from Trojan refugee to Roman ancestor. As the classical tradition was reaching its full development in the Mediterranean world, other cultures were creating their own distinctive approaches to mythological thinking that would contribute different perspectives to humanity's collective exploration of divine nature, heroic possibility, and cosmic order. The Norse mythological tradition that developed in Scandinavia created perhaps the darkest and most psychologically complex treatment of divine nature and cosmic destiny in any ancient culture. Unlike other mythologies that generally assumed the ultimate triumph of order over chaos, Norse myths presented a universe heading toward inevitable destruction in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The Norse pantheon was dominated by Odin, the All-Father whose pursuit of wisdom and magical power made him simultaneously creator and destroyer, protector and betrayer. His sacrifice of his eye for wisdom and his hanging on Yggdrasil to discover the runes demonstrated a divine nature that was willing to undergo any suffering to gain knowledge and power. Odin's character combined shamanic wisdom with political cunning and warrior valour in ways that made him both admirable and terrifying. His ravens Hugin and Munin carried information from throughout the Nine Worlds, while his eight-legged horse Sleipnir could travel between realms of existence. These supernatural abilities made him the most knowledgeable being in existence, but his knowledge included awareness of his own inevitable doom. The trickster god Loki represented chaos and change within the divine order, serving both as companion to the gods and as agent of their eventual destruction. His shape-shifting abilities and silver tongue made him invaluable for solving problems that straightforward action could not address, but his nature also made him unreliable and ultimately dangerous. Loki's binding after the death of Balder created the conditions that would eventually lead to Ragnarok. His torture, chained beneath a serpent that dripped venom on his face, was both divine justice and cosmic necessity. His eventual escape would signal the beginning of the final battle between order and chaos. The death of Balder, the beautiful god whose demise marked the beginning of the end for the Norse pantheon, was accomplished through Loki's manipulation of the blind god Hod. The mistletoe dart that killed Balder was the only thing in existence that had not sworn not to harm him, making his death both accidental and inevitable. Frigg's attempt to recover Balder from the underworld failed when Loki, disguised as an old woman, refused to weep for the dead god. This refusal to mourn prevented Balder's resurrection and ensured that the process leading to Ragnarok could not be stopped. The incident demonstrated how individual choice could have cosmic consequences, and how divine intervention could not overcome fundamental cosmic law. The Norse understanding of heroic behaviour emphasised courage in the face of certain doom rather than hope for ultimate victory. The Einherjar, warriors chosen to die in battle and brought to Valhalla, spent eternity preparing for a final battle they knew they could not win. Their valour lay not in confidence of success, but in determination to fight against impossible odds for principles they believed in. The Volsung saga, which told the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the cursed treasure of Andvari, created one of mythology's most complex treatments of heroic destiny and the relationship between fate and free will. Sigurd's achievement in killing the dragon Fafnir was simultaneously personal triumph and participation in cosmic necessity that would ultimately destroy him and everyone he loved. The Nibelung treasure that Sigurd won through his dragon slaying came with a curse that ensured its possession would bring disaster to all who held it. The curse was not arbitrary divine malice, but the natural consequence of violating fundamental laws that governed the relationship between human ambition and cosmic order. The love triangle between Sigurd, Brynhild, and Gudrun created psychological complexity that explored how individual passion could conflict with social obligation and how personal choices could serve larger patterns of destiny. The eventual destruction of all three characters was not simple tragedy, but cosmic necessity that demonstrated the ultimate futility of individual will when opposed to universal law. The Celtic mythological traditions that flourished in Ireland, Wales, and Britain created their own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature, heroic achievement, and the relationship between this world and the other world. The Irish Ulster cycle, centred on the hero Cuchulainn, presented heroic psychology with unique emphasis on the relationship between individual excellence and collective responsibility. Cuchulainn's childhood exploits established him as a hero whose abilities exceeded normal human limits, while his loyalty to his people created obligations that would ultimately destroy him. His single-handed defence of Ulster against the armies of Connaught demonstrated how individual courage could serve collective survival, but his death while still young showed the price that extraordinary achievement demanded. The Tainbo Quailnge, which recounted the cattle raid that provided the background for Cuchulainn's greatest exploits, was simultaneously heroic, epic, and sophisticated exploration of how economic competition could escalate into cosmic conflict. The seemingly simple dispute over ownership of the Brown Bull of Cooley became a mythological battleground where individual heroes played out cosmic dramas of honour, loyalty, and sacrifice. The Welsh Mabinogion presented Celtic mythology through stories that emphasised transformation, magic, and the permeability of boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary reality. The story of Math, son of Mathonwy, explored how magical power could be both gift and curse, how supernatural abilities created responsibilities that ordinary mortals could not escape. The Chinese mythological tradition that was developing during the same period created its own unique perspectives on divine nature, cosmic order, and human destiny. The stories of the Yellow Emperor, the Dragon Kings, and the Eight Immortals presented models of heroic achievement that emphasized harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. The Chinese understanding of cosmic order emphasized balance and cyclical change, rather than linear progress or ultimate conquest. The yin-yang principle that governed all existence meant that every force contained its opposite, and that cosmic health required the dynamic interaction of complementary principles rather than the triumph of one over another. The Hindu mythological tradition that was also developing during this period created perhaps the most complex and philosophically sophisticated treatment of divine nature and cosmic order in any ancient culture. The stories contained in the Mahabharata and Ramayana presented heroic psychology and divine intervention with unprecedented depth and subtlety. Arjuna's dialogue with Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, preserved in the Bhagavad Gita, created one of mythology's most profound explorations of duty, action, and the relationship between individual will and cosmic purpose. Krishna's revelation of his divine nature demonstrated how ultimate reality could manifest through ordinary circumstances while transcending all particular forms. The Ramayana's treatment of Rama and Sita's relationship provided an ideal of married love and social responsibility, while also exploring how individual virtue could be tested through cosmic necessity. Sita's abduction by Ravana and her eventual rejection by Rama demonstrated how even perfect love could be destroyed by social pressures and cosmic forces beyond individual control. As these various mythological traditions were reaching their mature forms, they began to interact and influence each other through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquests created unprecedented opportunities for mythological synthesis and cross-cultural fertilization. The syncretic deities that emerged during this period, like Serapis, who combined aspects of Egyptian Osiris with Hellenistic religious sensibilities, demonstrated how mythological thinking could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential spiritual functions. These hybrid figures created new possibilities for religious expression while maintaining connections to ancient wisdom traditions. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the Mediterranean world during the later centuries BCE and the early centuries CE adapted mythological narratives to provide direct spiritual experience through initiation rituals that recreated divine stories in ways that transformed participants' understanding of life and death. The Eleusinian mysteries, based on the story of Demeter and Persephone, provided initiates with direct experience of death and resurrection that offered hope for posthumous existence while also creating psychological transformation in current life. The secrecy that surrounded these mysteries ensured their survival for centuries while also preserving the numinous power that made them spiritually effective. The Dionysiac mysteries explored ecstatic religious experience through ritual recreation of the god's death and resurrection, providing participants with opportunities to transcend ordinary consciousness and experience divine reality directly. These practices anticipated later developments in mystical religion while maintaining connections to ancient mythological wisdom. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through 3.5 millennia of mythological thinking, we find ourselves in the presence of humanity's most sustained attempt to understand the deepest mysteries of existence through narrative art. These ancient stories provided templates for understanding love and loss, power and responsibility, individual achievement and collective welfare that remain relevant to contemporary audiences seeking meaning and guidance. The psychological sophistication, artistic beauty, and spiritual insight embedded in these mythological traditions continue to influence literature, art, philosophy, and religious thought throughout the world. Their exploration of archetypal patterns and universal themes transcends their particular cultural origins to speak to enduring aspects of human nature and cosmic order. The heroes and heroines we have encountered, from Inanna and Gilgamesh to Odysseus and Aeneas, from Cuchulainn and Sigurd to Rama and Arjuna, represent not just ancient fantasies, but enduring explorations of human possibility and limitation. Their stories continue to provide guidance for anyone seeking to understand the challenges of growth, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of transcendence. In the quiet hours when consciousness settles into its nightly rhythm of rest and renewal, these ancient voices continue to offer their gifts of wisdom, beauty, and hope. Their narratives remain available as sources of insight and inspiration for contemporary audiences who recognize in them profound truths about the human condition and cosmic order. The mythological imagination that created these stories established the foundation for all subsequent literature, art, and spiritual expression. Its influence extends through every culture and historical period, providing the archetypal patterns and narrative structures that continue to shape how human beings understand themselves and their place in the universe. These ancient myths remind us that the deepest truths about existence cannot be captured in simple propositions, but require the complexity of narrative art to reveal their full significance. They demonstrate how imagination and truth can collaborate to create meaning that transcends individual experience, while speaking to universal concerns about love, death, meaning, and transcendence. As these timeless voices fade into the eternal silence that follows all storytelling, they leave us with their most precious legacy, the understanding that human beings are meaning-making creatures whose stories can transform experience into wisdom, suffering into significance, and mortality into participation in eternal patterns that connect individual lives with cosmic purposes greater than any single existence can encompass. The myths end, but their deepest truth remains eternally present, that consciousness participates in divine creativity, that imagination can reveal realities invisible to ordinary perception, and that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we might become have the power to transform existence itself into forms more beautiful, more meaningful, and more worthy of the infinite potential that dwells within every human heart, brave enough to believe in something greater than itself. Yet, as we prepare to bid farewell to these ancient voices, the shadows seem to whisper of other mythological traditions whose stories we have barely glimpsed, cultures whose unique perspectives on divine nature, heroic achievement, and cosmic order add essential dimensions to humanity's collective exploration of existence's deepest mysteries. In the spaces between the great traditions we have examined, Other civilizations were weaving their own complex narratives about gods and mortals, creation and destruction, love and loss. The Slavic mythological tradition that flourished across the vast forests and steppes of Eastern Europe created some of the most psychologically complex treatments of the relationship between civilization and wilderness, order and chaos, life and death ever developed. These stories emerged from cultures that lived in intimate contact with vast forests, harsh winters, and the constant presence of forces that could either nurture or destroy human communities. Perun, the thunder god whose oak groves dotted the Slavic landscape, embodied divine masculine power in its most elemental form. His eternal battle with Veles, the serpentine god of the underworld and cattle, represented the cosmic struggle between sky and earth, order and chaos, that played out in every thunderstorm and seasonal change. But this was not a simple dualistic conflict. Both gods were essential to cosmic balance, and their opposition was creative rather than purely destructive. The myth of their conflict began with Veles stealing Perun's cattle, wife, or children. The sources vary, but the theft always involved something precious that connected the thunder god to earthly life. Perun's pursuit of Veles across the landscape created the features of the natural world, mountains, rivers, forests, through the violence of their cosmic battle. Lightning bolts that missed their target became sacred oaks, while Veles's retreat underground created the cave systems and underground rivers that dotted Slavic territory. The resolution of their conflict was never permanent victory but temporary resolution that had to be renewed with each seasonal cycle. Veles's death and resurrection corresponded to the agricultural year, while Perun's triumph marked the return of spring and the renewal of fertility. This cyclical understanding of cosmic conflict influenced Slavic approaches to politics, agriculture, and personal relationships for centuries. The witch figure of Baba Yaga represented perhaps mythology's most complex treatment of feminine power that transcended conventional categories of good and evil. Her iron teeth, chicken-legged hut, and fence of bones created an image of terrifying supernatural authority, but her role in folktales was often that of helper, rather than hindrance for heroes who approached her with proper respect and understanding. Baba Yaga's tests of visitors to her forest domain required more than courage or strength. They demanded wisdom, humility, and the ability to recognize when conventional social rules no longer applied. Heroes who succeeded in gaining her aid learned that apparent monstrosity could conceal profound wisdom, that terror and assistance could emerge from the same source, and that the most valuable help often came from the most unlikely sources. The dual nature of Baba Yaga's character, simultaneously threatening and nurturing, destructive and creative, reflected Slavic understanding of how divine feminine power operated beyond human moral categories. Her domain at the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead made her a gatekeeper, whose approval was necessary for any successful transition between different states of existence. The Japanese mythological tradition that was developing during the same general period created its own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature, natural forces, and the relationship between human communities and supernatural powers. The Shinto tradition that emerged from these early beliefs would influence Japanese culture for millennia, while maintaining its essential animistic understanding of divine presence in natural phenomena. The creation myth preserved in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki presented the formation of the Japanese islands through the cosmic dance of Izanagi and Izanami, divine siblings whose union produced both the landscape and the kami that would govern natural and social order. Their creative work began in perfect harmony, but the birth of the fire god Kagutsuchi burned Izanami to death, creating the first experience of loss and separation in the divine realm. Izanagi's journey to Yomi, the underworld, to retrieve his deceased wife became one of mythology's most psychologically penetrating treatments of grief, love, and the impossibility of reversing death's transformation. His horror at discovering Izanami's decayed condition in the realm of the dead reflected not just personal revulsion, but cosmic recognition that death created irreversible changes that even divine love could not undo. The pursuit that followed Izanagi's flight from Yomi established the fundamental rhythm of life and death that would govern existence thereafter. Izanami's promise to kill 1,000 people each day was balanced by Izanagi's counter-promise to create 1,500, ensuring that life would always triumph over death, while acknowledging that death remained an essential aspect of cosmic order. The purification ritual that Izanagi performed after returning from the underworld created some of Shinto's most important kami. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, from his left eye, Tsukuyomi, the moon god, from his right eye, and Susanoo, the storm god, from his nose. This transformation of pollution into purity, contamination into divine power, would become central to Japanese understanding of how spiritual cleansing could create, rather than simply restore sacred conditions. The conflict between Amaterasu and her brother Susanoo provided Japanese mythology with its most complex exploration of sibling rivalry, divine authority, and the relationship between order and chaos. Susanoo's violent behaviour, destroying rice fields, defiling sacred spaces, and ultimately throwing a flayed horse through the roof of Amaterasu's weaving hall, represented not mere destructiveness but the principle that excessive order required disruptive intervention to remain vital. Amaterasu's withdrawal into the heavenly rock cave plunged the world into darkness and brought all creative activity to a halt. Her retreat was not simple punishment for Susanoo's behaviour, but cosmic necessity. The sun goddess could not continue her life-giving work, while her realm was being violated by chaotic forces that threatened fundamental sacred boundaries. The elaborate ritual that the other kami performed to lure Amaterasu from her cave involved music, dance, laughter, and the strategic use of mirrors and jewels that created irresistible curiosity about what could be causing such celebration, while the world remained dark. The success of their stratagem demonstrated how community cooperation and creative problem-solving could overcome even the most serious cosmic crises. The mirror that Amaterasu saw when she emerged from the cave became one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, symbolizing the sun goddess's continued presence in the world and her special relationship with Japanese imperial authority. This connection between mythological narrative and political legitimacy would influence Japanese culture for centuries while maintaining the essential animistic understanding that divine presence manifested through natural phenomena. The Native American mythological traditions that flourished across the diverse landscapes of North America created perhaps the most ecologically sophisticated approaches to understanding divine nature and human responsibility ever developed. These traditions emerged from cultures that lived in intimate relationship with specific natural environments and understood divine power as manifesting through the complex interactions between all forms of life. The Hopi creation stories that described the emergence of human beings through successive worlds provided one of mythology's most psychologically complex treatments of consciousness development and moral evolution. Each world that humanity inhabited represented a different stage of spiritual and ethical development, with destruction and renewal occurring when communities lost connection with fundamental spiritual principles. The first world was populated by insect people, who lived in harmony with Tawa, the sun's spirit, until they began fighting among themselves and forgot their spiritual responsibilities. The destruction of this world through fire was not divine punishment, but natural consequence. When consciousness becomes dominated by conflict and competition, it creates conditions that make continued existence impossible. The second world featured animal people who developed more sophisticated forms of social organization but eventually succumbed to materialism and spiritual neglect. Its destruction by ice demonstrated how spiritual coldness could freeze the life force that animated all existence, making renewal necessary for continued development. The third world saw the emergence of human-like beings who developed advanced technologies and complex civilizations, but used their abilities for domination rather than harmony. The great flood that destroyed this world was not arbitrary divine wrath, but cosmic rebalancing that cleared away the accumulated consequences of choices that violated natural law. The fourth world, where current humanity lives, was created as an opportunity for consciousness to achieve the balance and wisdom that had been lost in previous iterations. But this world also contains the seeds of its own potential destruction, and its continuance depends on whether human communities can learn to live in harmony with natural forces and spiritual principles. The trickster figure that appeared in various forms throughout Native American mythology, as coyote, raven, rabbit, or Anansi, represented creative chaos that served essential cosmic functions despite apparent destructiveness. These figures were not evil, but embodied the principle that excessive order required disruptive intervention to remain vital and responsive to changing circumstances. Coyote's adventures in the mythologies of southwestern tribes demonstrated how apparent foolishness could serve wisdom, how selfish behaviour could produce unintended benefits for entire communities, and how the most important cultural innovations often emerge from the actions of figures who violated conventional social expectations. Raven's theft of light in Pacific Northwest mythology created one of the most psychologically sophisticated treatments of how consciousness and illumination spread through communities. Raven's motivation was not altruistic service, but personal curiosity and appetite, yet his actions brought benefits to all living beings that no amount of good intentions could have achieved. The Lakota tradition of the white buffalo woman provided one of mythology's most profound treatments of how divine revelation could transform human consciousness and social organization. Her appearance during a time of famine and spiritual crisis brought not only practical knowledge about the sacred pipe and its ceremonial use, but also fundamental teachings about the interconnectedness of all life and the responsibility that consciousness bears for the welfare of all beings. The 7 sacred rites that White Buffalo Woman taught established frameworks for understanding birth, death, vision-seeking, healing, and community renewal that integrated practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom. These ceremonies created opportunities for individual transformation, while also strengthening community bonds and maintaining proper relationships with natural forces. The African mythological traditions that flourished across the continent's diverse landscapes created their own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature, ancestral wisdom, and the relationship between individual identity and collective responsibility. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa developed particularly sophisticated theological and psychological insights that would eventually influence religious thought throughout the Americas. The creation stories centered on Olodumare, the supreme deity whose relationship with the Orisha represented one of mythology's most complex treatments of how ultimate reality manifests through multiple divine personalities while maintaining essential unity. Each Orisha embodied specific aspects of divine nature and cosmic function, but all were understood as expressions of the single source that transcended all particular manifestations. Ifa, the Orisha of wisdom and divination, provided Yoruba culture with one of the world's most sophisticated systems for understanding how cosmic patterns manifested through individual circumstances. The complex literary corpus associated with Ifa divination contained thousands of stories, poems, and philosophical insights that addressed every aspect of human experience while maintaining connection to fundamental spiritual principles. The trickster figure of Eshu, who served as messenger between divine and human realms, embodied the principle that communication and transformation required figures who could operate outside conventional social boundaries. Eshu's role at crossroads, doorways, and other liminal spaces made him essential for any successful transition between different states of existence. The ancestor veneration that formed the foundation of many African mythological systems created sophisticated understanding of how individual identity persisted beyond physical death, while remaining connected to living communities through ongoing relationships of mutual responsibility and support. The ancestors were not distant spirits, but active participants in contemporary life, whose wisdom and protection could be accessed through appropriate ritual procedures. As these diverse mythological traditions were developing across different continents and cultures, they began to interact through trade, migration, and conquest, creating opportunities for synthesis and mutual enrichment that produced new forms of mythological thinking while preserving essential insights from older traditions. The mystery schools that flourished throughout the ancient Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic and Roman periods created institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting mythological wisdom while adapting it to serve the spiritual needs of increasingly cosmopolitan populations. These schools transformed mythological narratives from cultural inheritance into personal spiritual practices that could provide direct experience of divine reality. The Hermetic tradition that developed in Alexandria during the early centuries of the Common Era created one of the most sophisticated syntheses of Greek philosophical thinking, Egyptian magical practices, and Near Eastern mystical insights ever achieved. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus presented mythological wisdom in forms that addressed both intellectual and experiential dimensions of spiritual development. The principle of correspondence that lay at the heart of Hermetic thinking, as above, so below, provided a theoretical foundation for understanding how mythological patterns manifested at all levels of reality, from cosmic cycles to individual psychological development. This understanding made mythological study a form of practical wisdom that could guide both personal transformation and social action. The alchemical tradition that emerged from Hermetic sources used mythological symbolism to describe processes of psychological and spiritual transformation that converted base material into refined consciousness. The stages of alchemical work corresponded to mythological narratives of death and resurrection, dissolution and reconstitution that had appeared in cultures throughout the world. The Gnostic systems that developed during the same period created their own distinctive approaches to mythological interpretation, emphasizing the hidden knowledge that could liberate consciousness from the limitations imposed by ignorance and social conditioning. These systems presented mythological narratives as coded descriptions of cosmic architecture and divine psychology that revealed the true nature of reality to those capable of understanding their symbolic language. The Neoplatonic schools that flourished from the 3rd through 6th centuries CE created perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated approaches to mythological interpretation ever developed, treating ancient stories as multivalid texts that revealed different levels of truth depending on the reader's capacity for understanding. This hermeneutical approach preserved mythological wisdom while making it relevant to contemporary philosophical and spiritual concerns. The Christian appropriation of pagan mythological themes during the same period created new forms of religious narrative that maintained essential archetypal patterns while adapting them to serve monotheistic theological purposes. The stories of saints and martyrs often preserved pagan mythological structures while presenting them within Christian doctrinal frameworks. The Islamic tradition that emerged during the 7th century created its own distinctive approaches to mythological thinking while maintaining essential insights about divine nature, prophetic authority, and the relationship between individual soul and cosmic order. The Quranic narratives of earlier prophets presented familiar mythological figures, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, within frameworks that emphasized divine unity and human responsibility. The Sufi mystical tradition that developed within Islam created sophisticated methods for using mythological symbolism to describe states of consciousness and spiritual development that transcended ordinary conceptual understanding. The poetry of figures like Rumi, Hafez, and Ibn Arabi presented mythological themes as direct descriptions of mystical experience rather than merely symbolic representations. The medieval synthesis that emerged in both Christian and Islamic cultures during the later centuries of the first millennium created institutional frameworks for preserving classical mythological wisdom while adapting it to serve contemporary religious and philosophical purposes. The cathedral schools, universities, and scholarly institutions that developed during this period maintained libraries and educational programs that kept ancient texts available to new generations of readers. The vernacular literature that began flourishing in various European languages during the medieval period created new forms of mythological narrative that adapted classical themes to address contemporary concerns while maintaining essential archetypal patterns. The Arthurian romances, Germanic epics, and Celtic storytelling traditions created hybrid forms that combined Christian themes with pagan mythological structures. The Renaissance recovery of classical text created unprecedented opportunities for scholars and artists to engage directly with ancient mythological sources while developing new methods of interpretation and adaptation that would influence European culture for centuries. The printing press made mythological texts available to broader audiences, while scholarly editions provided more accurate versions of ancient sources than had been available for centuries. The age of exploration that began during the Renaissance created opportunities for European cultures to encounter mythological traditions from throughout the world, leading to new forms of synthesis and comparison that revealed both universal patterns and distinctive cultural variations. The ethnographic studies that emerged from these encounters provided modern scholarship with access to mythological traditions that had previously been unknown to literate cultures. The scientific revolution that transformed European thinking during the 16th and 17th centuries created new challenges for mythological thinking, while also revealing deeper levels of archetypal pattern that operated within physical and psychological processes. The mechanistic worldview that dominated early modern science initially seemed incompatible with mythological approaches to understanding reality, but later developments would reveal unexpected connections between scientific and mythological insights. The Enlightenment critique of religious authority and traditional knowledge during the 18th century created both challenges and opportunities for mythological thinking. While rationalist philosophers dismissed mythological narratives as primitive superstition, other thinkers recognized their psychological and aesthetic value, while developing new methods of interpretation that revealed their continuing relevance. The Romantic movement that emerged during the late 18th and early 19th centuries created renewed appreciation for mythological thinking, while developing new approaches to understanding its relationship to creativity, imagination, and psychological development. The Romantic emphasis on feeling, nature, and individual experience provided frameworks for understanding mythological narratives as expressions of fundamental human experiences rather than merely primitive explanations of natural phenomena. The development of comparative mythology during the 19th century created systematic methods for studying mythological traditions from different cultures while identifying universal patterns and distinctive variations. The work of scholars like Friedrich Max Müller, and James Frazer provided new theoretical frameworks for understanding how mythological thinking operated across different cultures and historical periods. The emergence of depth psychology during the late 19th and early 20th centuries created unprecedented opportunities for understanding the psychological functions that mythological thinking served in both individual development and cultural formation. The work of Freud, Jung, and their successors revealed how mythological patterns operated within the unconscious mind, while influencing conscious experience and creative expression. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provided theoretical foundation for understanding how archetypal patterns manifested through mythological narratives, while also operating within individual psychological development. His analysis of mythological symbols and their relationship to individuation processes created new possibilities for therapeutic application of mythological insights. The anthropological studies that flourished during the 20th century created detailed documentation of mythological traditions from cultures throughout the world, while developing new theoretical approaches to understanding their social, psychological, and spiritual functions. The work of scholars like Claude Lévi-Strauss, Joseph Campbell, and Mircea Eliade provided comprehensive frameworks for understanding how mythological thinking operated across different cultures and historical periods. Campbell's identification of the monomyth, or universal hero's journey, provided one of the most influential modern approaches to understanding how mythological patterns operated across different cultures while serving essential psychological and social functions. His analysis of how these patterns manifested in both ancient and contemporary narratives demonstrated the continuing relevance of mythological thinking for modern audiences. The influence of mythological thinking on modern literature, art, cinema, and popular culture demonstrates its continuing vitality and relevance for contemporary audiences seeking meaning, beauty, and transcendence. The archetypal patterns that ancient mythologies established continue to provide frameworks for understanding human experience while inspiring creative expression that speaks to universal concerns about identity, relationship, and purpose. The therapeutic applications of mythological thinking that have developed within various forms of psychological and spiritual practice demonstrate how these ancient insights remain relevant for contemporary healing and personal development. The use of mythological narratives in therapy, education, and spiritual guidance provides individuals and communities with resources for understanding and transforming their own experiences. The ecological insights embedded within many mythological traditions offer valuable perspectives for contemporary discussions about environmental sustainability, climate change, and the proper relationship between human civilization and natural processes. The animistic understanding that divine presence manifests through natural phenomena provides alternatives to mechanistic approaches that treat nature as mere resource for human exploitation. The artistic achievements inspired by mythological themes throughout human history demonstrate how these ancient stories continue to generate creative expression that transcends cultural boundaries while speaking to universal human experiences of beauty, meaning, and transcendence. From ancient cave paintings to contemporary digital art, mythological imagery continues to provide symbols and narratives that connect individual creativity with collective wisdom. As our extended journey through humanity's mythological heritage draws toward its close, we find ourselves profoundly enriched by exposure to narrative traditions that have shaped human consciousness for millennia, while continuing to offer guidance and inspiration for contemporary challenges. These ancient stories represent humanity's most sustained attempt to understand the deepest mysteries of existence through the transformative power of imagination and narrative art. The psychological sophistication, artistic beauty, and spiritual insight embedded in mythological traditions from around the world continue to challenge and inspire contemporary audiences who discover in them perspectives on fundamental human concerns that remain as relevant today as they were when first told around ancient fires. Their exploration of archetypal patterns, universal themes, and the relationship between individual experience and cosmic order transcends their particular cultural origins to speak to enduring aspects of human nature. The heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, tricksters and wise ones we have encountered throughout this journey represent not merely ancient fantasies, but enduring explorations of human possibility and limitation. Their stories continue to provide templates for understanding the challenges of growth, the meaning of suffering, the nature of love, and the possibility of transcendence that speaks to every generation. In the deepening quiet of these late hours, as consciousness prepares for its own nightly journey through the realm of dreams and renewal, these ancient voices continue to offer their timeless gifts of wisdom, beauty, and hope. Their narratives remain available as sources of insight and inspiration for anyone seeking to understand the deeper patterns that connect individual lives with larger purposes and meanings. The mythological imagination that created these stories established the foundation for all subsequent literature, art, philosophy, and spiritual expression. Its influence extends through every culture and historical period, providing the archetypal patterns and narrative structures that continue to shape how human beings understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the cosmic order. These ancient myths remind us that the deepest truths about existence cannot be captured in simple propositions or rational arguments, but require the complexity and richness of narrative art to reveal their full significance. They demonstrate how imagination and truth can collaborate to create meaning that transcends individual experience while speaking to universal concerns about love, death, meaning, and the search for transcendence. As these timeless voices fade into the eternal silence that embraces all temporal expression, they leave us with their most precious legacy, the understanding that human beings are storytelling creatures whose narratives can transform experience into wisdom, suffering into significance, and mortality into participation in eternal patterns that connect every individual life with cosmic purposes greater than any single existence can fully comprehend. The myths return now to their rest in the silence of eternity, but their deepest truth remains forever present and available to every consciousness that seeks with sincerity and opens itself to the mystery that underlies all appearance. Their wisdom lives on in every moment of wonder, every act of creative love, every gesture of hope that affirms life's ultimate meaning despite temporary difficulties and loss. The ancient voices speak their final blessing across the centuries, that the light they kindled in human consciousness will never be extinguished, that the patterns they revealed will continue to guide seekers in every generation, and that the love and wisdom they embodied will continue to transform the world through every person who dares to believe that existence is sacred, and that every individual story participates in the grand narrative of cosmic becoming. That is the universe, discovering itself through countless forms of consciousness reaching toward ever greater beauty, meaning, and transcendent love. Yet even as we prepare for our final departure from this vast landscape of human imagination, other voices seem to whisper from the margins of memory, mythological traditions whose stories illuminate aspects of existence that our journey has only begun to explore. In the remote corners of the earth, in the spaces between the great civilizations we have visited, other cultures were developing their own profound insights into the nature of reality, consciousness, and the mysterious forces that shape both individual destiny and cosmic order. The Aboriginal Dreamtime tradition of Australia represents perhaps humanity's oldest continuous mythological system, preserving stories and wisdom that stretch back more than 60,000 years of unbroken cultural transmission. These narratives emerge from a landscape so ancient and geologically stable that the stories themselves seem to embody the deep time of the earth itself, offering perspectives on existence that dwarf the concerns of agricultural civilizations and their relatively recent mythologies. The Dreamtime is not simply a primordial past, but an eternal dimension of reality that remains accessible to those who know how to perceive it. The ancestor spirits who shaped the landscape during the Dreamtime continue to inhabit sacred sites, rock formations, and natural features that serve as gateways between ordinary consciousness and the deeper reality that underlies all appearances. The rainbow serpent, whose journey across the primordial landscape created rivers, mountains, and valleys, embodies the creative principle that transforms formless potential into structured reality. But this serpent is not a distant creator deity. It remains actively present in waterholes, seasonal floods, and the life-giving moisture that sustains all existence in the harsh Australian environment. The songlines that crisscross the continent create a mythological geography where every landscape feature corresponds to episodes in ancestral journeys, making the entire continent a vast sacred text that can be read by those initiated into its symbolic language. These song paths connect sacred sites across thousands of miles, while preserving practical knowledge about water sources, seasonal changes, and survival techniques that have enabled Aboriginal cultures to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The initiation ceremonies that transmit this mythological knowledge create some of the most sophisticated approaches to consciousness transformation ever developed. The elaborate ritual procedures that guide young people through symbolic death and rebirth experiences provide direct access to Dreamtime consciousness, while also transmitting practical knowledge and cultural values necessary for adult responsibility. The Mesoamerican mythological traditions that flourished among the Maya, Aztec, and other indigenous peoples of Central America created perhaps the most astronomically sophisticated approaches to understanding cosmic cycles and their relationship to human destiny ever developed. These cultures understood time not as linear progression, but as complex interwoven cycles that created recurring opportunities for transformation and renewal. The Maya creation story preserved in the Popol Vuh presented the formation of the current world through multiple attempts by the gods to create beings capable of proper worship and remembrance. The previous creations, humans made from mud, then wood, failed because they lacked the consciousness and gratitude necessary to maintain proper relationships with divine forces. Only the current humans, formed from maize, possessed the awareness required to sustain cosmic order through appropriate ritual activity. The hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, whose adventures in the underworld established fundamental patterns for understanding death and resurrection, represented perhaps mythology's most sophisticated treatment of how consciousness could triumph over the forces of entropy and dissolution through courage, cleverness, and mutual support. Their ball game with the Lords of Death was not mere entertainment, but cosmic drama that determined whether life or death would dominate existence. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Maya mythology enabled their priests to predict eclipses, planetary movements, and seasonal changes with extraordinary accuracy, while also understanding these phenomena as manifestations of divine will and cosmic personality. The Venus cycle, lunar phases, and seasonal variations were not merely physical events, but expressions of divine psychology that influence both individual destiny and collective welfare. The Aztec understanding of cosmic cycles through the 5 suns provided one of mythology's most profound treatments of how consciousness and reality evolved through successive stages of development and destruction. Each sun represented a different experiment in cosmic organization that ended when its fundamental principles became exhausted or corrupted, requiring renewal through catastrophic transformation. The current 5th sun, dominated by the god Tonatiuh, was understood to be sustained by human sacrifice that provided the solar deity with the energy necessary to continue his daily journey across the sky. This seemingly barbaric practice reflected sophisticated theological understanding of how consciousness and cosmic order required constant renewal through the willing offering of life force by beings capable of conscious choice. The Persian mythological tradition preserved in Zoroastrian sources created perhaps the most ethically sophisticated approach to understanding the cosmic struggle between good and evil ever developed. Unlike dualistic systems that presented light and darkness as equally powerful opposing forces, Zoroastrian mythology understood evil as parasitic distortion of good that would ultimately be overcome through the conscious cooperation of divine and human will. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord whose perfect wisdom and goodness created the universe, faced opposition from Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit whose nature was pure negation and whose only pleasure came from corrupting and destroying what others had created. But this conflict was not eternal stalemate. It was cosmic drama with predetermined resolution in favour of wisdom, truth, and creative love. The 6 Amisha Spentas or Holy Immortals who served as Ahura Mazda's primary agents represented different aspects of divine wisdom and cosmic order that human beings could embody through conscious choice and ethical action. These figures were simultaneously divine personalities and moral principles, making them both objects of devotion and practical guides for righteous living. The concept of Fravati or spiritual doubles provided Zoroastrian thought with sophisticated understanding of how individual consciousness related to cosmic order and divine purpose. Each person's Fravati existed in the divine realm as their perfect spiritual essence, serving both as ideal toward which earthly existence could aspire and as guardian spirit that provided guidance and protection during incarnate life. The final renovation of the universe through the resurrection of the dead and the establishment of perfect justice provided Zoroastrianism with perhaps history's most optimistic vision of cosmic destiny. Unlike cyclical mythologies that saw history as endless repetition, or tragic mythologies that emphasized inevitable decline, Zoroastrian eschatology presented existence as progressive development toward ultimate perfection. The Baltic mythological traditions that flourished among the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian peoples created their own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature and cosmic order while maintaining sophisticated astronomical knowledge and agricultural wisdom. These traditions survived Christian conversion more completely than most European pagan systems, preserving ancient wisdom about seasonal cycles, natural forces, and the proper relationship between human communities and environmental processes. Pakunas, the thunder god whose worship extended throughout Baltic territories, embodied divine masculine power that manifested through storms, seasonal changes, and the fertility that followed winter's death. His eternal conflict with the serpentine Velnias represented not simple good versus evil, but the creative tension between structure and chaos that generated all natural phenomena. The goddesses of fate, Laima in Lithuanian tradition, Mara in Latvian mythology, provided these cultures with sophisticated understanding of how individual destiny unfolded within cosmic patterns that could be influenced but not arbitrarily changed. These deities wove the threads of individual lives while also responding to human choices and divine intervention that could modify predetermined patterns. The Lithuanian Dainos, or traditional songs, preserved mythological wisdom through oral tradition that maintained remarkable consistency across centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure. These songs contained practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and crafts, while also transmitting religious insights about divine nature, ancestral wisdom, and proper relationships with natural forces. The Finnish mythological tradition preserved in the Kalevala created perhaps the most musically sophisticated approach to understanding how divine power manifested through sound, rhythm, and creative expression. The central figure of Vainamoinen, whose singing and harp playing could reshape reality itself, embodied the principle that consciousness and cosmic order were fundamentally musical in nature. The creation of the world through the breaking of the cosmic egg laid by Luonnotar, the nature goddess, provided Finnish mythology with a uniquely feminine approach to understanding cosmic origins. The fragments of the broken egg became earth, sky, sun, moon, and stars, while Luonnotar herself became the sea that nurtured all subsequent life. The Sampo, the magical mill that could produce whatever its owner needed, represented one of mythology's most sophisticated treatments of technology and its relationship to human welfare. The struggle for possession of the Sampo between the heroes of Kalevala and the witches of Pohjola demonstrated how technological power could serve either creative or destructive purposes, depending on the wisdom and ethics of those who controlled it. The shamanic traditions that flourished across Siberia, Central Asia, and the Arctic regions created perhaps the most practically oriented approaches to mythological thinking ever developed. These cultures understood mythology not as abstract speculation about cosmic order, but as operational knowledge necessary for survival in harsh environments, and for maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual forces that governed natural phenomena. The world tree that connected earthly existence with divine realms was not merely symbolic concept, but practical reality that shamans could navigate during altered states of consciousness. The roots that extended into underworld domains, the The trunk that represented ordinary reality and the branches that reached into heavenly realms provided maps for consciousness exploration that enabled shamanic practitioners to retrieve lost souls, communicate with spirits, and gain knowledge necessary for healing and guidance. The animal spirit guides that assisted shamanic practitioners represented sophisticated understanding of how different aspects of consciousness and natural intelligence could be accessed through identification with specific creatures and their unique capabilities. The eagle's perspective, the bear's strength, the wolf's social intelligence, and the salmon's knowledge of seasonal cycles became available to shamans who learned to embody these archetypal energies. The seasonal ceremonies that maintained harmony between human communities and natural cycles integrated practical knowledge about environmental conditions with spiritual practices that honored the consciousness inherent in all natural phenomena. These rituals ensured that hunting, gathering, and other survival activities were conducted with proper respect for the spiritual dimensions of existence. The Jewish mythological traditions that began emerging during the first millennium BCE created revolutionary approaches to understanding divine nature, human responsibility, and historical purpose that would influence religious thought throughout the world. The Hebrew Bible preserved mythological narratives that combined ancient Near Eastern themes with distinctive theological insights about monotheism, ethical responsibility, and cosmic justice. The creation story in Genesis presented divine creativity as conscious choice rather than cosmic necessity, establishing the principle that existence itself was gift rather than inevitable process. The God who created through speech, rather than sexual generation or violent conflict, represented transcendent consciousness that could bring order from chaos through pure will and wisdom. The Garden of Eden narrative provided sophisticated psychological exploration of consciousness, choice, and the relationship between knowledge and moral responsibility. The Tree of Knowledge represented not arbitrary divine prohibition, but recognition that certain forms of awareness carried inevitable consequences that would fundamentally alter human nature and destiny. The story of Cain and Abel established archetypal patterns for understanding sibling rivalry, violence, and the relationship between individual choice and collective responsibility. Cain's murder of his brother was not mere personal crime, but cosmic violation that disrupted fundamental social bonds and created the conditions that would require new forms of justice and redemption. The flood narrative preserved in the story of Noah combined universal themes of cosmic destruction and renewal with distinctive Hebrew insights about divine justice, human wickedness, and the possibility of redemption through righteousness. The Rainbow Covenant that concluded the flood story established the principle that divine mercy could moderate cosmic justice while maintaining moral order. The mythological elements embedded in the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, Jacob's wrestling with the divine messenger, Joseph's interpretation of dreams, created templates for understanding how individual lives could participate in cosmic purposes that transcended personal concerns, while still honoring individual identity and freedom. The Exodus narrative that became central to Jewish identity combined historical memory with mythological themes of liberation, divine intervention, and the establishment of covenant relationships that would define proper relationships between divine authority and human responsibility. The plagues that preceded the departure from Egypt, the miraculous crossing of the sea, and the revelation at Sinai created a mythological framework for understanding how divine justice operated within historical processes. As these diverse mythological traditions continued to develop and interact through trade, migration, and cultural exchange, they created unprecedented opportunities for synthesis and mutual enrichment that would produce new forms of spiritual understanding while preserving essential insights from older traditions. The Hellenistic mystery schools that flourished throughout the Mediterranean world during the later centuries, BCE, created institutional frameworks for transmitting mythological wisdom across cultural boundaries, while adapting ancient insights to serve the needs of increasingly cosmopolitan populations. The Eleusinian mysteries, based on Demeter and Persephone, the Dionysiac celebrations and the Mithraic initiations provided direct spiritual experience through ritual recreation of mythological narratives. The Christian appropriation and transformation of pagan mythological themes during the first centuries of the Common Era created new forms of religious narrative that preserved essential archetypal patterns while adapting them to serve monotheistic purposes. The stories of virgin birth, death and resurrection, and ascension to heaven drew upon mythological themes that appeared throughout the ancient world while presenting them within distinctive theological frameworks. The medieval synthesis that emerged in both Christian and Islamic cultures created comprehensive systems of knowledge that integrated classical philosophical insights with mythological wisdom and revealed religious truth. The great cathedrals, universities, and libraries that developed during this period preserved ancient texts while creating new forms of artistic and intellectual expression that drew upon mythological inspiration. The Renaissance recovery of classical sources and the Age of Exploration's encounter with mythological traditions from around the world created unprecedented opportunities for comparative study and artistic inspiration that would influence European culture for centuries. The printing press made mythological texts available to broader audiences, while scholarly editions provided more accurate versions than had been available since antiquity. The scientific revolution and Enlightenment criticism that transformed European thinking during the 16th through 18th centuries created both challenges and opportunities for mythological thinking. While mechanistic science and rationalist philosophy initially dismissed mythology as primitive superstition, later developments would reveal unexpected connections between scientific insights and archetypal patterns. The Romantic movement's renewed appreciation for imagination, nature, and emotional experience created frameworks for understanding mythology as expression of fundamental human experiences rather than mere primitive explanation of natural phenomena. The emphasis on individual creativity and subjective experience provided new contexts for appreciating mythological insights about consciousness, transformation, and transcendence. The development of comparative religion, anthropology, and depth psychology during the 19th and 20th centuries created systematic methods for studying mythological traditions while identifying universal patterns and cultural variations. The work of scholars like Max Müller, James Frazer, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Joseph Campbell, and Carl Jung provided theoretical frameworks for understanding how mythological thinking operated across cultures while serving essential psychological and social functions. The influence of mythological thinking on modern literature, art, cinema, and popular culture demonstrates its continuing vitality for contemporary audiences seeking meaning, beauty, and transcendence. The archetypal patterns established by ancient mythologies continue to provide frameworks for understanding human experience while inspiring creative expression that speaks to universal concerns about identity, relationship, and purpose. The therapeutic applications that have developed within various forms of psychological and spiritual practice demonstrate how ancient mythological insights remain relevant for contemporary healing and personal development. The use of mythological narratives in therapy, education, and spiritual guidance provides individuals and communities with resources for understanding and transforming their experiences. The ecological wisdom embedded within many mythological traditions offers valuable perspectives for contemporary discussions about environmental sustainability and the proper relationship between human civilization and natural processes. The animistic understanding that consciousness permeates all existence provides alternatives to mechanistic approaches that treat nature as mere resource for human exploitation. In these final moments of our extended journey through humanity's mythological heritage, we find ourselves profoundly transformed by exposure to narrative traditions that have shaped human consciousness across millennia, while continuing to offer guidance and inspiration for contemporary challenges. These ancient stories represent our species' most sustained attempt to understand existence's deepest mysteries through the transformative power of imagination, narrative art, and shared cultural wisdom. The mythological traditions we have encountered, from the ancient Near East to the Celtic lands, from the Hindu traditions to the Native American wisdom, from the African spiritual systems to the Aboriginal Dreamtime, continue to speak across cultural boundaries and historical periods to fundamental human concerns about love and loss, creation and destruction, individual identity and cosmic purpose. Their heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, tricksters and wise teachers represent enduring explorations of human possibility and limitation that transcend their particular cultural origins to address universal questions about how consciousness relates to reality, how individual lives participate in larger patterns of meaning, and how finite beings can touch infinite possibilities through courage, wisdom, and love. as consciousness prepares for its own nightly journey through the realm of dreams and renewal. These ancient voices offer their final gifts, the understanding that human beings are meaning-making creatures whose stories can transform suffering into significance, whose imagination can reveal truth invisible to ordinary perception, and whose creative collaboration with divine possibility can continually recreate existence in forms ever more beautiful, just, and worthy of the infinite potential that dwells within every awakening heart. The mythological imagination that created these stories established the foundation for all subsequent human culture, providing the archetypal patterns and narrative structures that continue to shape literature, art, philosophy, religion, and the ongoing human quest for meaning and transcendence. Their influence extends through every generation, offering each new cohort of human beings the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors while also providing frameworks for understanding contemporary challenges and opportunities. The ancient myths return now to their eternal rest in the silence that embraces all temporal expression, but their deepest truth remains forever accessible to every consciousness willing to listen with open heart and receptive mind. Their legacy lives on in every act of creative love, every gesture of hope that affirms meaning despite difficulty, every moment when human awareness touches something greater than itself and discovers that existence is sacred, that consciousness participates in divine creativity, and that every individual story contributes something precious to the ongoing cosmic adventure of reality, discovering itself through infinite forms of awakening awareness, reaching toward ever greater beauty, wisdom, and transcendent love. But before we allow these eternal voices to fade completely into the cosmic silence, there remain hidden chambers in the vast palace of human mythological consciousness that we have only glimpsed in passing, sacred traditions whose wisdom adds essential dimensions to our understanding of how ancient peoples grappled with the most fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and the mysterious forces that shape both individual destiny and universal order. The Tibetan mythological tradition, preserved in the ancient Bon religion and later integrated into Buddhist frameworks, created perhaps the most sophisticated approaches to understanding consciousness, death, and the bardos, or intermediate states that exist between different modes of being. These traditions emerged from one of the world's most challenging environments, where survival depended on understanding subtle energy patterns, seasonal changes, and the spiritual forces that governed both physical and psychological well-being. The Tibetan understanding of death as a journey through multiple intermediate states provided humanity with its most detailed maps of consciousness during the dying process. The Bardo Thodol, or Book of the Dead, described how awareness moved through successive stages of dissolution and transformation that offered opportunities for liberation if approached with proper preparation and understanding. The Dakini figures that populated Tibetan mythological consciousness represented divine feminine wisdom in its most dynamic and transformative aspects. These sky-dancing goddesses embodied the principle that enlightenment came not through static perfection, but through the fearless embrace of change, uncertainty, and the creative chaos that generated new possibilities for consciousness development. The Tibetan concept of tulkus, or consciously reincarnating teachers, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how individual consciousness could maintain continuity across multiple lifetimes, while adapting to different historical circumstances and cultural needs. These figures served as living bridges between mythological wisdom and contemporary application, showing how ancient insights could remain relevant across centuries of cultural change. The mountain deities that governed Tibet's sacred peaks were understood to be actively involved in human affairs, requiring proper relationships and ceremonial attention to maintain the environmental harmony that human communities needed for survival. These traditions created some of the world's most sophisticated approaches to ecological spirituality that understood natural features as conscious beings deserving respect and appropriate interaction. The Indonesian mythological traditions that flourished across the vast archipelago of Southeast Asia created their own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature, heroic achievement, and the relationship between human communities and the spiritual forces that governed natural phenomena. The Ramayana and Mahabharata epics were adapted to local conditions and cultural perspectives, creating hybrid traditions that maintained essential archetypal patterns while addressing regional concerns and environmental conditions. The wayang shadow puppet traditions that preserved and transmitted mythological narratives throughout Indonesian culture created sophisticated theatrical forms that made ancient stories accessible to entire communities, while also providing frameworks for understanding contemporary social and political issues. These performances served both entertainment and educational functions, ensuring that mythological wisdom remained relevant to each generation's concerns and challenges. The Javanese concept of the Ratu Adil, or just king, provided political mythology, with sophisticated understanding of how legitimate authority emerged from spiritual development, rather than mere hereditary succession or military conquest. This tradition influenced Indonesian political thought for centuries, while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom about the relationship between personal character and social responsibility. The Balinese Hindu traditions that synthesized Indian religious concepts with local animistic beliefs created unique forms of spiritual practice that understood every aspect of daily life as participation in cosmic drama. The elaborate temple ceremonies, artistic traditions, and agricultural festivals that characterized Balinese culture demonstrated how mythological consciousness could remain vital and relevant in contemporary life. The Pacific Islander mythological traditions that developed across the vast expanses of Oceania created perhaps humanity's most sophisticated approaches to understanding navigation, seasonal cycles, and the spiritual dimensions of seafaring cultures. These traditions preserved practical knowledge about ocean currents, weather patterns, and celestial navigation, while also maintaining profound insights about consciousness, transformation, and the relationship between individual identity and cosmic order. The Polynesian creation stories that described the emergence of islands from primordial waters provided these cultures with sophisticated understanding of geological processes and environmental change that enabled them to adapt successfully to volcanic activity, climate variations, and the challenges of life on small islands surrounded by vast ocean expanses. The Maui cycle of stories that appeared throughout Polynesian cultures created one of mythology's most psychologically complex treatments of the trickster hero whose creative mischief served essential cosmic functions despite apparent selfishness and disregard for conventional social boundaries. Maui's theft of fire, his fishing up of islands, and his attempt to conquer death demonstrated how individual creativity could serve collective welfare even when motivated by personal desire rather than altruistic intention. The navigation traditions that enabled Pacific Islander cultures to traverse vast ocean distances, using only traditional knowledge of wind patterns, ocean swells, and celestial movements, represented practical applications of mythological understanding about the relationship between consciousness and natural forces. These navigational methods required intimate knowledge of environmental patterns that could only be maintained through generations of careful observation and cultural transmission. The ancestor veneration practices that connected Pacific Islander communities with the spiritual presence of deceased family members and cultural heroes created sophisticated approaches to understanding how individual identity persisted beyond physical death, while remaining available to assist living communities through ongoing relationships of mutual responsibility and support. The Andean mythological traditions that flourished among the Inca and other indigenous peoples of South America created their own distinctive approaches to understanding divine nature, social organization, and the relationship between human communities and the dramatic environmental conditions of high-altitude existence. These traditions integrated practical knowledge about agriculture, architecture, and social cooperation with profound spiritual insights about consciousness, transformation, and cosmic order. The Inca understanding of Aini, or reciprocal relationship, provided social mythology with sophisticated frameworks for organizing community cooperation, resource distribution, and environmental stewardship that maintained ecological balance while supporting complex urban civilizations. This principle influenced Andean political and economic thinking for centuries, while demonstrating how mythological consciousness could generate practical solutions to social and environmental challenges. The Huaca concept that understood sacred power as manifesting through specific landscape features, architectural sites, and natural phenomena created comprehensive sacred geographies that connected entire regions through networks of ritual relationship and ceremonial obligation. These systems ensured that environmental resources were managed with spiritual as well as practical considerations in mind. The Inca royal mythology that presented the emperor as direct descendant of Inti, the sun god, created sophisticated approaches to understanding political legitimacy, social hierarchy, and the responsibilities that accompanied supreme authority. These traditions influenced Andean political thought while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom about the relationship between individual character and collective welfare. The Quipu recording systems that preserved historical, mathematical, and mythological information through complex arrangements of knotted strings demonstrated how non-literate cultures could maintain sophisticated knowledge transmission systems that served both practical and spiritual functions. These devices preserved mythological narratives, genealogical information, and ceremonial procedures across generations without requiring written language. The archaeological discoveries that continue to illuminate ancient mythological practices provide contemporary audiences with unprecedented insights into how these spiritual traditions functioned within their original cultural contexts. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, and similar sites throughout the world continues to push back the timeline of sophisticated religious and mythological thinking while revealing the central role that such beliefs played in early human civilization. The megalithic monuments that appear throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas demonstrate that mythological consciousness inspired massive collaborative projects that required sophisticated engineering knowledge, social organization, and astronomical understanding. Stonehenge, the pyramids, Angkor Wat, and countless other sites represent material expressions of mythological insights about cosmic order, divine presence, and the proper relationship between human communities and universal forces. The rock art traditions that appear on every continent preserve some of humanity's earliest attempts to record mythological narratives, spiritual experiences, and the relationship between consciousness and natural phenomena. These artistic expressions provide direct access to ancient mythological thinking while demonstrating the central role that creative expression played in spiritual development and cultural transmission. The burial practices that archaeological investigation continues to reveal throughout the world demonstrate how mythological understanding of death, afterlife, and spiritual transformation influence practical decisions about treatment of the deceased, organization of cemetery sites, and the preservation of cultural memory. These practices provide insights into ancient psychological and spiritual sophistication that rivals any contemporary understanding of consciousness and identity. The seasonal festivals and agricultural ceremonies that appear in every mythological tradition created institutional frameworks for maintaining community solidarity while ensuring that practical knowledge about environmental cycles, crop management, and resource conservation was transmitted across generations within meaningful spiritual contexts. These celebrations integrated individual identity with collective welfare while maintaining proper relationships with natural forces. The winter solstice celebrations that appear throughout Northern Hemisphere cultures provided communities with sophisticated approaches to managing the psychological challenges of seasonal darkness, resource scarcity, and social isolation that threaten survival during the most difficult months of the year. These festivals created opportunities for community bonding, resource sharing, and spiritual renewal that enabled cultures to maintain hope and cooperation during challenging periods. The spring renewal ceremonies that mark the return of agricultural activity provided frameworks for understanding death and rebirth, individual transformation, and the cyclical nature of existence that connected personal development with natural processes. These celebrations created opportunities for forgiveness, reconciliation, and new beginnings that served both psychological and social functions. The harvest festivals that celebrated agricultural abundance provided communities with opportunities to express gratitude, share resources, and plan for future needs, while maintaining awareness of the spiritual dimensions of food production and environmental stewardship. These celebrations created cultural contexts for understanding abundance and scarcity, individual prosperity and collective welfare. The initiatory mysteries that appeared in every mythological tradition created institutional frameworks for guiding individuals through the psychological and spiritual transformations that mark transition from childhood to adult responsibility, from ignorance to wisdom, from ordinary consciousness to direct spiritual experience. These practices provided carefully structured opportunities for consciousness development that served both individual growth and community stability. The masculine initiation rites that guided young men through symbolic death and rebirth experiences created sophisticated approaches to understanding courage, responsibility, and the integration of aggressive impulses within socially constructive contexts. These practices provided frameworks for channeling competitive and violent tendencies into activities that served community welfare while also enabling individual achievement and recognition. The feminine initiation traditions that honored the biological and spiritual transformations associated with menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth created sacred contexts for understanding the relationship between individual female experience and cosmic creative principles. These practices provided frameworks for integrating sexuality, fertility, and spiritual development while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom about feminine divine power. The shamanic initiation experiences that appeared throughout indigenous cultures created some of the most sophisticated approaches to consciousness, exploration, and spiritual development ever developed. These practices provided carefully structured opportunities for direct encounter with non-ordinary states of awareness, while maintaining connection to practical knowledge about healing, divination, and community guidance. The mystery school traditions that flourished throughout the ancient world created institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting mythological wisdom, while providing direct spiritual experience through ritual practices that recreated divine narratives in ways that transformed participants' understanding of reality, identity, and cosmic purpose. These schools influenced intellectual and spiritual development throughout the Mediterranean world, while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom traditions. The philosophical applications of mythological thinking that developed throughout the ancient world created sophisticated approaches to understanding consciousness, reality, and ethical responsibility that influenced intellectual development for millennia. The Platonic dialogues, Aristotelian analyses, and Neoplatonic syntheses demonstrated how mythological insights could be integrated with rational inquiry to create comprehensive worldviews that addressed both practical and transcendent concerns. The therapeutic applications that various cultures developed for mythological narratives created sophisticated approaches to healing psychological trauma, resolving emotional conflicts, and facilitating personal transformation that anticipated many contemporary insights about mental health and spiritual development. These practices understood mythology as active medicine for consciousness, rather than mere entertainment or cultural artifact. The educational functions that mythological narratives served throughout human history created comprehensive approaches to knowledge transmission that integrated practical information with ethical guidance, cultural values, and spiritual wisdom. These educational systems understood learning as transformation of character, rather than mere accumulation of information, creating graduates who could serve both individual advancement and collective welfare. The political applications of mythological thinking throughout human history created frameworks for understanding legitimate authority, social organization, and the proper relationship between individual rights and collective responsibility that influenced governmental development while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom about leadership, justice, and civic virtue. The artistic inspiration that mythological narratives provided throughout human history generated creative expressions that transcended their original cultural context to speak to universal human experiences of beauty, meaning, and transcendence. From ancient cave paintings to contemporary digital art, mythological imagery continues to provide symbols and narratives that connect individual creativity with archetypal wisdom. The scientific insights that began emerging from mythological thinking in various cultures created foundations for systematic observation, mathematical analysis, and theoretical understanding of natural phenomena that would eventually develop into modern scientific methods, while maintaining awareness of the consciousness-related dimensions of existence that purely materialistic approaches often overlook. The ecological wisdom that many mythological traditions preserved provided sophisticated understanding of environmental relationships, resource management, and sustainable practices that enabled human communities to thrive within natural limits, while maintaining awareness of the spiritual dimensions of ecological stewardship that contemporary environmental movements are rediscovering. The psychological insights that mythological narratives embody continue to provide valuable resources for understanding human development, relationship dynamics, and the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality that modern therapeutic approaches are recognizing as essential for mental health and spiritual development. In these final passages of our extraordinarily extended journey through humanity's mythological heritage, we find ourselves in the presence of wisdom, traditions that represent our species' most sustained and sophisticated attempt to understand the deepest mysteries of existence through the transformative power of narrative imagination and shared cultural insight. The archetypal patterns, psychological insights, and spiritual wisdom that these traditions preserve continue to speak across all cultural boundaries and historical periods to fundamental human concerns about identity, relationship, purpose, and transcendence that remain as relevant today as they were when first explored around ancient fires by our earliest storytelling ancestors. The heroes and villains, gods and monsters, wise teachers and trickster figures that populate these mythological landscapes represent enduring explorations of human possibility and limitation that transcend their particular cultural manifestations to address universal questions about how consciousness relates to reality, how individual lives participate in larger patterns of meaning, and how finite beings can touch infinite possibilities through courage, wisdom, and love. As consciousness prepares for its eternal rest in the cosmic silence that embraces all temporal expression, these ancient voices offer their final and most precious gift: the understanding that human beings are mythological creatures whose stories have the power to transform existence itself, whose imagination can reveal truths invisible to ordinary perception, and whose creative collaboration with divine possibility can continually recreate reality in forms ever more beautiful, meaningful, and worthy of the infinite potential that dwells within every awakening heart. The mythological traditions we have encountered across this vast journey, spanning continents and millennia, cultures and consciousness states, individual transformation and cosmic order, continue to offer their eternal invitation to participate in the ongoing adventure of reality, discovering itself through countless forms of awakening awareness, reaching always toward greater beauty, deeper wisdom, and more comprehensive love. Their deepest truth remains eternally accessible to every consciousness willing to listen with wonder rather than skepticism, with reverence rather than analysis, with the innocent heart that recognizes in these ancient stories not primitive fantasies, but profound explorations of what it means to be conscious, creative, and capable of love in a universe whose ultimate nature remains forever mysterious, yet eternally present in every moment of genuine encounter with existence itself. The myths fade now into the infinite silence from which they first emerged, but their essential message echoes through eternity, that consciousness and cosmos are ultimately one, that individual stories and universal meaning are inseparably intertwined, and that the love and wisdom these ancient voices embodied continues to transform existence through every person who dares to believe that life has sacred significance, and that every awakening moment participates in the divine creativity that is reality itself, endlessly discovering ever more beautiful ways to know and express its own infinite nature. Yet in this deepest hour of our communion with humanity's mythological soul, when the boundaries between teller and tale, dreamer and dream begin to dissolve, we find ourselves touching something even more fundamental than the stories themselves: the eternal wellspring of consciousness from which all narratives emerge and to which they all return. In this sacred space, beyond cultural distinctions and historical categories, the universal patterns that underlie all mythological thinking become visible as expressions of consciousness itself exploring its own infinite nature through the mirror of story. The shamanic traditions that appear in every culture, from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest, from the Siberian steppes to the Australian outback, represent perhaps humanity's most direct approach to understanding how consciousness navigates between different levels of reality. These practices emerged independently across vast distances and cultural differences, suggesting that they tap into fundamental aspects of human awareness that transcend any particular environmental or social condition. The shamanic understanding of reality as consisting of multiple interconnected worlds, the ordinary middle world of daily existence, the upper world of spiritual teachers and cosmic principles, and the lower world of ancestral wisdom and natural powers, provides a universal framework for understanding how consciousness operates across different states of awareness and modes of being. The shamanic journey, undertaken through drumming, chanting, dancing, or other consciousness-altering techniques, creates a controlled method for exploring these alternate realities while maintaining connection to ordinary awareness. This practice demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how consciousness can expand beyond its usual boundaries, while retaining the integration necessary for practical functioning in daily life. The power animals and spirit guides that appear in shamanic traditions throughout the world represent archetypes that transcend cultural conditioning to speak directly to universal aspects of consciousness and natural intelligence. The eagle's perspective that provides cosmic vision, the bear's strength that enables survival through difficult periods, the wolf's social wisdom that creates community cooperation, and countless other animal spirits provide templates for understanding different modes of awareness and action. The healing work that shamanic practitioners perform involves understanding illness as spiritual as well as physical disruption, requiring intervention at multiple levels of reality to restore proper relationships between individual consciousness, community harmony, and natural forces. This holistic approach to health anticipates contemporary insights about the interconnection between psychological, social, and environmental factors in wellness and disease. The cosmological knowledge that shamanic traditions preserve includes sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, astronomical patterns, and ecological relationships that enabled human communities to thrive in challenging environments while maintaining awareness of the consciousness that permeates all natural phenomena. This knowledge was not merely practical but deeply spiritual, treating every aspect of existence as sacred and deserving reverent attention. The mythological narratives that emerge from shamanic consciousness often involve journeys between worlds, encounters with non-human intelligences, and transformations that fundamentally alter the traveller's understanding of reality and identity. These stories provide maps for consciousness exploration while also preserving practical knowledge about healing, divination, and community guidance. The trance states that shamanic practitioners cultivate create direct access to mythological consciousness, enabling them to experience archetypal realities as lived truth rather than mere symbolic representation. This experiential approach to mythology transforms ancient stories from cultural artifacts into active spiritual technologies that can facilitate healing, insight, and transformation. The universality of shamanic practices across human cultures suggests that consciousness itself possesses inherent capacities for transcendence, healing, and wisdom that do not depend on particular cultural conditioning or historical circumstances. These practices point toward fundamental aspects of human nature that remain constant, despite superficial differences in belief systems, social organization, and environmental adaptation. The mythological themes that appear universally across human cultures, the hero's journey, the descent into death and return to life, the cosmic battle between order and chaos, the sacred marriage that unites opposing principles, the world tree that connects different levels of reality, represent archetypal patterns that emerge from the deepest structures of consciousness itself, rather than from cultural borrowing or historical influence. The hero's journey that Joseph Campbell identified as the universal monomyth describes the process by which consciousness expands beyond its familiar boundaries to encounter challenges, gain wisdom, and return with gifts that serve the broader community. This pattern appears in every mythological tradition because it reflects the fundamental structure of psychological and spiritual development that characterizes human maturation regardless of cultural context. The death and resurrection theme that appears in mythologies worldwide represents consciousness's encounter with its own capacity for transformation, renewal, and transcendence of apparent limitations. These narratives explore how awareness can survive the dissolution of familiar identity structures while discovering deeper levels of existence that were previously hidden or unconscious. The cosmic conflict between order and chaos that provides dramatic tension for countless mythological narratives reflects consciousness's ongoing negotiation between stability and change, structure and freedom, predictability and creativity. These stories explore how apparent opposites can be integrated into dynamic balance, rather than resolved through simple victory of one principle over another. The sacred marriage or hieros gamos that appears throughout world mythology represents consciousness's recognition of its own fundamental unity, despite apparent dualities and divisions. These narratives explore how opposing forces, masculine and feminine, earth and sky, mortal and divine, can be united in ways that generate new possibilities for existence and meaning. The world tree or axis mundi that connects different levels of reality in many mythological systems represents consciousness's understanding of its own multidimensional nature and its capacity for movement between different states of awareness and modes of being. This symbol provides a framework for understanding how individual consciousness participates in cosmic order while maintaining its unique perspective and agency. The flood myths that appear in cultures throughout the world represent consciousness's encounter with its own capacity for radical transformation that dissolves existing structures while creating opportunities for renewal and regeneration. These stories explore how apparent destruction can serve creative purposes when approached with wisdom, courage, and faith in life's fundamental regenerative power. The creation stories that appear in every mythological tradition represent consciousness exploring its own creative nature and its relationship to the reality it experiences and co-creates. These narratives investigate fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the relationship between mind and matter, and the purpose and meaning of conscious experience itself. The trickster figures that appear throughout world mythology represent consciousness's recognition of its own capacity for transcending conventional boundaries, challenging established orders, and creating new possibilities through creative disruption and playful experimentation. These characters embody the principle that innovation and transformation often require violation of existing rules and expectations. The divine feminine figures that appear in mythologies worldwide represent consciousness's exploration of receptive, nurturing and transformative aspects of existence that complement and balance more aggressive, structuring and stabilizing masculine principles. These goddesses embody wisdom, compassion, creativity, and the power to birth new realities from the union of consciousness with its own infinite potential. The divine masculine figures that appear throughout world mythology represent consciousness's exploration of active, structuring, and protective aspects of existence that provide stability, order, and direction, while also embodying the courage necessary for exploration, transformation, and transcendence. These gods embody justice, strength, wisdom, and the power to create and maintain beneficial structures. The ancestor traditions that appear in every culture represent consciousness's understanding of its own continuity across time and its connection to the accumulated wisdom and experience of previous generations. These practices create frameworks for maintaining cultural knowledge while also providing individuals with access to guidance and support that transcends their immediate circumstances and limitations. The prophecy and divination traditions that appear throughout human cultures represent consciousness's recognition of its own capacity for accessing information and insight that transcends ordinary sensory experience and rational analysis. These practices explore how awareness can perceive patterns, possibilities, and potentials that are not immediately apparent through conventional observation. The ritual and ceremonial practices that appear in every mythological tradition create structured opportunities for consciousness to experience sacred dimensions of existence, while also maintaining proper relationships with natural forces, community members, and spiritual realities. These practices provide frameworks for transformation, healing, and renewal that serve both individual development and collective welfare. The artistic expressions that mythological consciousness generates throughout human history demonstrate how awareness naturally seeks to create beauty, meaning, and transcendent value through creative collaboration with inspiration that seems to emerge from sources beyond ordinary personal identity. These expressions provide direct access to mythological consciousness for audiences who encounter them across cultural and temporal boundaries. The moral and ethical insights that mythological narratives embody reflect consciousness's exploration of how individual choices and actions relate to larger patterns of meaning, purpose, and consequence that extend beyond immediate personal concerns. These teachings provide guidance for living in ways that serve both individual fulfillment and collective flourishing. The transformational potential that mythological thinking offers contemporary individuals and communities demonstrates its continuing relevance for addressing current challenges while maintaining connection to the perennial wisdom that has guided human development throughout history. These ancient insights provide resources for understanding and responding to contemporary problems in ways that serve both practical effectiveness and spiritual development. The ecological wisdom that many mythological traditions preserve offers essential perspectives for addressing environmental challenges while maintaining awareness of the sacred dimensions of natural processes and phenomena. These teachings provide frameworks for understanding human responsibility within larger ecological systems, while also honouring the consciousness that permeates all existence. The psychological insights that mythological narratives embody continue to provide valuable resources for understanding human development, healing trauma, and integrating conscious and unconscious aspects of personality in ways that promote both individual wholeness and social harmony. These stories offer maps for inner transformation that remain relevant regardless of changing cultural circumstances. The spiritual dimensions of mythological consciousness point toward ultimate realities that transcend particular cultural expressions while remaining accessible to anyone willing to approach them with appropriate reverence, openness, and understanding. These traditions provide pathways for direct experience of sacred dimensions of existence that complement and enrich rational and scientific approaches to understanding reality. In these ultimate moments of our vast journey through humanity's mythological heritage, we find ourselves face to face with the deepest mystery of all, the nature of consciousness itself as the source and destination of all stories, the dreamer of all dreams, the eternal witness and participant in the ongoing adventure of existence, discovering its own infinite nature through countless forms of awakening awareness. The mythological traditions we have encountered across continents and centuries, cultures and consciousness states, individual transformation and cosmic order, all point toward this fundamental recognition that the consciousness reading these words and the consciousness that created these ancient stories are expressions of the same universal awareness that manifests through infinite diversity while maintaining essential unity. The heroes and heroines whose adventures we have followed, the gods and goddesses whose dramas we have witnessed, the wise teachers and trickster figures whose lessons we have received, are all aspects of our own deepest nature expressing itself through the mirror of narrative imagination. Their struggles are our struggles, their victories are our victories, their wisdom is our wisdom, and their love is our love. The battles between order and chaos that provide dramatic structure for mythological narratives are the same conflicts that consciousness faces in every moment as it navigates between stability and change, security and adventure, familiar patterns and creative possibilities. The resolutions that mythological heroes achieve through courage, wisdom, and love point toward resolutions available to anyone willing to face their own challenges with similar qualities. The deaths and rebirths that mythological figures experience represent the ongoing transformation that consciousness undergoes as it releases outdated identities, beliefs, and limitations while discovering deeper levels of existence that were previously hidden or unconscious. These stories provide encouragement and guidance for anyone willing to undergo the dissolution necessary for authentic growth and renewal. The sacred marriages that unite opposing principles in mythological narratives represent consciousness's recognition of its own fundamental wholeness, despite apparent divisions and conflicts. These unions point toward the integration available to anyone willing to embrace all aspects of their own nature, while maintaining awareness of the underlying unity that transcends all superficial differences. The wisdom that emerges from mythological consciousness continues to offer guidance for contemporary seekers who recognize in these ancient voices the echoes of their own deepest knowing. These traditions provide resources for understanding and navigating the eternal human challenges of love and loss, meaning and meaninglessness, individual identity and cosmic connection. The beauty that mythological imagination creates through story, symbol and artistic expression continues to enrich human experience by revealing the sacred dimensions of existence that are always present but often overlooked in the rush of ordinary consciousness. These creations provide windows into realities that transcend material limitations while remaining fully present in every moment of authentic encounter with life. The love that permeates mythological consciousness as its deepest essence continues to transform existence through every person who recognizes their fundamental connection to all beings and their participation in the universal compassion that seeks the welfare and awakening of all consciousness everywhere. This love is both the source and the goal of all mythological wisdom. As these ancient voices prepare for their final rest in the eternal silence that embraces all temporal expression, they offer their ultimate gift, the recognition that every consciousness reading these words is itself a mythological being, a character in the cosmic story that reality is telling about its own infinite nature, a hero or heroine on the eternal journey of awakening that is existence itself, discovering ever more beautiful ways to know and express its own sacred essence. The myths fade into silence now, but the consciousness that created them and the consciousness that receives them remain eternally present, forever engaged in the ongoing adventure of discovery, transformation, and love that is the deepest truth of existence itself. In this recognition, all stories find their completion, all journeys reach their destination, and all seeking discovers what it has always been. The eternal play of consciousness exploring its own infinite nature through the boundless creativity of mythological imagination, awakening to its own divine essence in every moment of genuine wonder, reverence, and love.